I want to welcome everyone to today's lesson, which, as you can see, deals with America declaring its independence. And as everyone is well aware of the story of Lexington and Concord and what happened there in April of 1775, but the way it started was that British General Gage had learned of hidden weapons in Concord. And so he sends his men from Boston to Concord, and they leave under the cover of darkness. And this is now brings us to the famous story of two lanterns hung in the church tower to signify that the British were coming by sea, meaning crossing the Charles River. And it kind of continues then with the famous midnight ride of Paul Revere and maybe the not so famous William Dawes, who also rode out to warn the colonists that the redcoats were coming. And as Gage's men had sent out for Concord on April 18th and marched through the night, it's actually on the 19th of April that the famous shot heard round the world, where these Minutemen stand in the field opposing the Redcoats as they continue on towards Concord. And one has to stop and think just exactly what these men were thinking. As here they were taking on probably the strongest army in the world. And you're going, they didn't have much military training or technology or experience at all. And so they do hold them off long enough. They hold off the Redcoats long enough so that by the time the Redcoats do get to Concord, those hidden weapons had already been taken and kind of handed out so that they didn't fall to the hands of the British. And as the British turn and make that roughly 10-mile trip back to Boston, the Minutemen will kind of take pot shots at them and harass them and track them and hit and run, kind of use guerrilla tactics against them all the way back to Boston, really kind of decimating the ranks somewhat. Several months later, in June of 75, the next kind of major engagement takes place at Bunker Hill, where General Howe lands his forces on the eastern side of the island there, or the peninsula, and as they charge up Breed's Hill or Bunker's Hill, it takes several charges that they march uphill to attack the colonists. But each time the colonists keep repelling the attack, and the British have to keep falling back. Finally, on about the third time, Howe's men are able to break through, and but not before the colonists had escaped back to safety. And so even though the colonists lose this battle, they do inflict heavy casualties upon the British, and it shows them that they can stand up to this well-trained army and give them some hope for the future. Meanwhile, the delegates to the Second Continental Congress had reconvened in May of 1775, and this time the representatives brought money with them to help establish the Continental Army. And it was quickly decided that George Washington would be the commander of that Continental Army, and they began to organize for war, buying guns, bullets, food, uniforms, collecting their money to be able to pay for soldiers. And yet, we're still over a year away from actually declaring independence. So even though armed conflict had began, there was hopes that they could still settle things peacefully. However, by December of 1775, because of the armed conflict that had taken place, England passes the Prohibitory Acts, where they blockade all trade between the colonists and the world. And so it's kind of a war on commerce, really, as well as a war on the fields. And because the Prohibitory Act, you can kind of imagine what happened with the colonists' trade. They're not only were they boycotting English goods at this point, but also because the Prohibitory Act, the blockade was put up to keep the colonists from trading with the world, and so therefore colonial trade, both the imports and exports, drastically falls and will hurt the war efforts. Early the next year, in January 1776, we see one of the most influential pamphlets published, Common Sense by Thomas Paine. Now, Common Sense becomes an instant bestseller, selling over 120,000 copies in the first 3 months. And in it, Paine challenges the authority of the British government and monarchy, and his plain language spoke to the common people of America, and it was actually the first work to openly ask for independence from Britain. And in it, he gives many justifications as to why America should break away. Another series of articles that Paine writes becomes known as the American Crisis. Now, this collection of articles was written during the war, with the first being published in December of 1776, after the colonies had already declared their independence. And actually, Washington found the first essay, so inspiring that he actually had it read to his men while they're at Valley Forge. And in it, you can see the quote here talking about the times that were so trying, and because early on things weren't going so good. But Paine gives encouragement to keep on fighting. But if we backtrack in time just a little bit to July of 1776, back to Philadelphia, the Second Continental Congress meets in what's known as Independence Hall today, and some of America's most prominent men met once again. Men like Ben Franklin, John Adams, Roger Sherman, and Thomas Jefferson. And what we see then is that as Thomas Jefferson did author the majority of the Declaration of Independence, it did go through several drafts, and some issues like slavery were stricken from it so as not to divide the Congress. And finally, on July 4th, 1776, the Second Continental Congress does sign the Declaration of Independence. Now, the Declaration of Independence is broken up into kind of three parts. The first part talks about the right of the people, with the famous line, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." And then it goes on to talk about the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The second part talks about the grievances towards King George and all the wrongdoings that he and Parliament had bestowed upon the colonists. And finally, the third part then is the actual declaring of independence from Great Britain. And it was at this point where Ben Franklin, at the signing of the Declaration, states that we must all hang together, or assuredly we shall all hang separately, as these men had just committed treason. And at this point, even though the Americans had declared their independence, not everybody was happy with that. And there was a good number of people that stayed loyalists, or people who were loyal to the king. Some of these men and women would eventually flee for their own safety to perhaps Canada or back to England. Others just kept it a secret and continued to living their lives in America. But nevertheless, there was a good portion of the population, kind of a big part down in the south, as you can see, that remained loyal to the crown. But I'll leave you with this chart here that you can perhaps fill in on your own as to what were some of the advantages and disadvantages of Britain and the Americans.